Welcome to the webinar, Mold, Moisture, and Money, How to Secure Funding to Address and Prevent Indoor Air Quality Issues. My name is Tracy Washington Enger. I'm with the Indoor Environments Division of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I will have the pleasure of serving as your facilitator. I will be joined on this webinar by two tireless defenders of healthy school indoor air quality, Indoor Air Quality Specialist Dave Blake and Peggy Caruso, Assistant Director of Maintenance, Operations, and the Environmental Department at Katy Independent School District in Texas. This webinar is one of a four-part series that was developed to address the specific areas school stakeholders in our network have committed to actively addressing in order to achieve dramatic results in health, academic, and building performance. You will have the opportunity to gain recognition for your knowledge acquisition and commitment to action through certificates of completion after finishing the evaluation for each training. Complete all 4 hours and you will be acknowledged with a certificate that recognizes you as an agent of IAQ action in schools. This webinar series builds on the foundational content in the Indoor Air Quality Masterclass Professional Webinar Series. The next action you can take on the way to improving indoor air quality in your schools is to join the IAQ Masterclass by viewing all 10 webinars in the series on demand. To benefit most fully from this webinar on mold and moisture, we are specifically recommending that in addition to the webinar on mold and moisture, you also view the webinars on cleaning and maintenance, smart material selection, and aggressive source control. Complete all 10 hours and you will be acknowledged with a certificate that recognizes your efforts towards IAQ mastery as a member of the IAQ Masterclass. Now, if you haven't done so already, grab your smart device and turn it into a powerful mold and moisture assessment tool by downloading the mobile app. This one-stop shop works on any mobile device. Whether you are just starting an IAQ program or already have one in place, the app can revolutionize the way your schools approach the complex task of IAQ management. Everything from the IAQ Tools for Schools Action Kit and framework is pulled together for easy use on any mobile device with internet access, whether it's your smartphone or a tablet. And of course, it's free to download and free to use. This app is designed to be easy to use with everything you need to identify, document, and report on your school's health right here, as well as the ability to file the report immediately. During this webinar, you will see demonstrations of how to use the mobile app to access the action kit and walkthrough checklists to identify and promptly act on sources of moisture and mold. For more in-depth information about using the mobile app, please view the webinar titled Healthy Schools, Healthy Students, Taking Action to Improve IAQ in Your School District. Mold is everywhere. This makes mold and moisture concerns particularly ubiquitous in schools. Regardless of size, age, or geographic location, every school is vulnerable to issues that arise from leaks, condensation, and other forms of moisture intrusion. Taking a proactive approach to moisture and mold issues in your schools is the key to finding potential problems and addressing them before they develop into a full-blown crisis. During this webinar, we will present the components of a systematic approach to managing mold and moisture that includes setting short and long-term goals to guide your action, evaluating your results, and communicating your success in order to secure the funding you need to sustain your efforts. Few things can be more damaging to a school district's buildings, staff, students' reputation, and budget than mold. When there is not an existing plan in place, the unexpected discovery of even a relatively small mold issue in one school can have a devastating impact on the entire school district. When what could have been a preventable moisture issue becomes an all-out mold crisis, costs can quickly skyrocket, and school districts have few choices except to pay up and pay fast. The associated costs can reverberate far beyond the budget to include impacts on instruction time, occupant health, and community trust. It is conditions like these that prompted us at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to develop the Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools Guide. The Tools for Schools Action Kit serves as the knowledge base of what schools and school districts need to do to put an IAQ plan in place. Since its original publication in the 1990s, the kit has been updated and refined to include even more of the best practices that we are seeing many of you implementing across the country. In addition to best practices, it provides walkthrough checklists, industry guidelines, sample policies, and sample IAQ management plans to help schools and school districts take immediate action to implement effective indoor air quality management programs. The framework for effective IAQ management helps school districts implement the kit using 6 key drivers and successful strategies. This webinar will touch on all of the key drivers with particular attention on the strategies under the Assess driver to conduct a walkthrough that is targeted to identifying mold and moisture issues, as well as the Act driver, which targets training strategies, and the Plan driver to help better position you to fund your mold prevention and remediation plan. In addition to the framework, the Action Kit offers 7 technical solutions. These are the major IAQ issues that the Action Kit and framework can be used to address in order to create green, clean, and healthy indoor environments in schools. The primary focus of this webinar is developing and implementing a mold and moisture plan that is proactive and financially sustainable. However, a successful and effective mold and moisture control plan requires involvement of actions and strategies under every single technical solution area. The Action Kit recommends proven strategies that are used by school districts across the country to control mold and moisture. And best yet, we know that these strategies work. We also know from surveying schools across the nation using the CDC's School Health Policies and Practices Study, or SHPS, that even with the severe consequences of dealing with a mold and moisture issue, at least 1/4 of schools still are not conducting routine inspections for mold and moisture sources. Only about half have established policies for addressing mold problems, and about 1/3 of schools are not training their staff to address mold and moisture problems. Of course, tackling the specifics of a general recommendation like conduct routine moisture inspections or establish a mold prevention and remediation plan can seem daunting for many overworked and overstretched staff people. That is why we are fortunate to have expert mentors like our next speaker. Dave Blake created and managed the Indoor Air Program at Northwest Clean Air Agency from 1991 until 2016. Working in close collaboration with Rich Prill, formerly of the Washington State University Cooperative Extension Energy Program, Dave has completed evaluations in all public and most private schools in a 3-county area of Northwest Washington State. He responded to a steady flow of indoor air quality concerns in homes, public and commercial buildings that were referred to him by 3 county health departments. Dave has delivered hundreds of presentations to diverse audiences on all topics related to indoor air quality. He was recognized by EPA's Region 10 for asbestos enforcement and his indoor air quality work, and shared the National EPA Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools Special Achievement Award and the IAQ Tools for Schools Distinguished Service Award with his colleague, Rich Prill. It is my distinct pleasure to present to you Dave Blake.
Thank you, Tracy and Michelle, for the chance to work with you today on this very important webinar. Today, we're going to target our walkthrough evaluation toward excess moisture control and mold prevention. We'll want someone with all the keys to the school to come along. The rest of the team can include anyone interested, a school nurse, principal, custodian, union rep, safety committee member, or visitor from the health department. We'll talk to people, keep our eyes open and other senses peeled, recording our observations along the way. We're going to refer to the use and utility of the new EPA School Indoor Air Quality app as much as possible, with 8 of 11 checklists useful for recording our moisture and mold observations and measurements. On the app's home screen, you can see that at the bottom you have access to the Action Kit, the walkthrough checklists, and links to frequently asked questions on EPA's website. More on the mobile app in a moment. We're looking for signs of excess moisture and possible mold growth, so obviously we'll be looking at endpoints of plumbing like bathrooms, kitchens, and sinks. As we're able, We'll also check the chases and crawl spaces and attics where pipes pass on their way from the city supply to those endpoints to make sure leaks or condensation issues are not encouraging mold growth. To get mold growth, we need mold spores, mold food, the right temperature, and moisture. You'll see that the most effective way to prevent mold growth is to combat excess moisture. We can't possibly keep mold spores from floating or being tracked into the building. We can assume that every square inch of the school surfaces host at least a few mold spores that simply wafted in from outside, just sitting there, not hurting anybody, until we add water. If you have a mold issue, it's because you have an excess moisture issue. If you allow steam to hit a ceiling, like in that picture, that's any ceiling in the country, it's going to get moldy. Is there mold growth in this school? There are generally 3 clues to watch for. Either you can physically see mold growth or suspicious water damage, smell it growing somewhere, or suspect its presence because health effects among the occupants suggest that possibility. So we want to observe every possible wall, ceiling, and floor surface in the room and check any suspicious areas for excess moisture using a handy moisture meter if available. There are many brands and models of devices that can sense and measure moisture in building surfaces. This moisture meter has pads on the back that detect moisture half an inch or more beneath a dry surface. A dry surface should be in the 8 to 12% moisture range, as all porous materials retain some moisture. As you will see, lots of trouble regarding potential mold growth starts at the 18% moisture content level. This is a pin-type moisture meter that penetrates into a surface. Using available 7-inch probes, you can actually punch through drywall and insulation to see if the inside of the outside of the building, the exterior sheathing, is damp. This is a different brand of pin-type moisture meter. I typically use the pin types to confirm a reading from the pad-type meter and important issues. Anything conductive like screws, wiring, metal studs, or metal corner beads hidden below paint on drywall can fake out a pad-type meter with a high reading that has nothing to do with excess moisture. You're less likely to fool pins. Some of these meters have both, pin and pad. If you have funds for a thermal imaging camera, so much the better. Thermal imaging cameras are more affordable all the time. Sensing heat, they can see cooler moisture stand out blue against the warmer, dry substrate hidden in the wall. Finding the leak sooner limits potential mold growth, exposure, and cost of cleanup. Even without these tools, watching for signs of excess mold-causing moisture like stained ceiling tiles or other drip marks on the walls will often guide you to the mold if the smell does not. Stained or discolored vinyl floor coverings could indicate a wet spot below. 100% on the meter shows the stain is due to moisture trapped below the vinyl. For drywall, the magic number seems to be about 18% moisture content. Above that 18%, the drywall will support mold growth. At 25%, this wallboard is not moldy on the painted side yet, but there's a pretty good chance there's going to be mold growing on the unpainted paper backside of the wallboard, typically in a wall cavity. Extensive mold growth in a wall cavity calls for careful cleanup with precautions similar to those used in asbestos abatement to prevent release of contamination from the moldy site. At 37%, the odds of hidden mold in the wall cavity are strong enough that the backside should be inspected at least. At anything over about 30% moisture content, this wallboard is essentially saturated. If not aggressively dried in a timely manner, the backside certainly needs to be inspected for mold growth. Make a note so a rush work order can facilitate a quick inspection to confirm or deny the presence of mold. If you can't see or smell mold in the inspection hole, keep drying the materials aggressively with dehumidified air in all the damp wall cavities. If we're too late to prevent mold growth, seal the hole and make plans for careful abatement with controls that are just about as tight as those used for asbestos cleanup projects. You can see why you'd want to erect plastic enclosures with negative pressure inside to protect the rest of the school from work zones where extensive mold is going to be cleaned up. If there's no mold evident in the inspection hole, it can be quickly covered with a blank switch plate. They come in different sizes, colors, and materials. Okay, so we have our team, the keys, maybe a fire escape map for reference, and some useful tools with our EPA walkthrough app as a recording device. Select the walkthrough inspection checklist, fifth down from the top on the left, and then we can work our way through the specific checklists for ground level, roof, attic, etc. as we move around the school. Starting our mold and moisture walkthrough evaluation outside, note where water routinely runs down the rigid sponge we call concrete, so we can check the room on the inside later. Here's another obvious example of potential trouble on the inside. And another. Something else to watch for outside is classrooms that are getting their outside walls routinely sprayed by the lawn sprinkler system. There is a place on the walkthrough app checklist to note these findings. Obviously, you want to note water collecting under your portable classrooms. That moisture evaporates up into the classroom, making condensation on cool surfaces that much harder to prevent in winter months. The best way to find out what's going on under portables and other structures with crawl spaces is to look. It's an important concept, controlling water vapor infiltration from below. So it's worth the time to do some spot checking and at least inventory all the spaces that need a closer inspection than time allows for today. Any wet crawl space will be contaminated with biological activity we don't want in the classroom. Wet classrooms can't be ignored because the force of warm air rising in the building, known as stack effect, will indeed pull that bad air constantly up through the penetrations into the breathing zone of the school population upstairs. Standing water evaporates, and the water vapor also gets pulled upstairs by the force of warm air rising. Whatever's in the pink slime, we don't want it getting up into the school. Finding and reporting it is the first step. On a scheduled routine walkthrough, we encountered this basement under a primary school. It was used for decades as a shooting range. Think of the lead contamination. To keep the dirt floor dust down, we use carpets that are spread on the ground. I say we loosely. Yes, that's a lot of mold. And a smoke tube easily demonstrated the stack effect was pulling air from this basement aggressively into the school upstairs. Decontaminating this space in this old school would cost many thousands of dollars. Instead, plastic was laid down and the entire space depressurized with exhaust fans to change the airflow. Now air moves from the occupied school down into the basement and then outside. It moves from clean to dirty to outside. This solution protected students and staff with a pressure barrier that was installed very quickly. Be sure to protect any humanity that enters a crawl space to check conditions or respond to a work order. A Tyvek suit and appropriate respiratory protection are a must. It's actually very interesting detective work if your back can handle it, and if you don't have issues with claustrophobia. Up on the roof, check for potential leaks as well as areas where water can accumulate, perhaps due to a plugged roof drain. Again, you can note this condition on your walkthrough app checklist. The thermal imaging camera can be a very useful tool for figuring out if you have leaks in a flat roof, as well as the extent of those leaks. So perhaps you can order a repair for just one section instead of wholesale replacement of such a big dollar item as a roof. This is how you do it. After a clear sunny day, with a clear night, little or no wind, and a dry roof surface, moisture accumulated under the roofing will light up on a thermal imaging camera because the water changes temperature much slower than the surrounding dry roof materials. An important detail is avoiding stepping off the roof in the dark. So you've noted this condition on your walkthrough app checklist. At the end of the checklist series of screens, you also have the opportunity to store photographs of the issues. Okay, entering the school, ideally, we'll find a series of mats at major entrances. We want to evaluate defense against tracked-in dirt and moisture at all doors to the exterior. Why chase dirt all over the school if it can be stopped at the door? Note the good walk-off mats. Check every entrance to the school so you can evaluate the defense against moisture intrusion in place. Of course you want to stop dirt at the door. You also want to keep as much moisture outside as possible. There's plenty of mold food and inert mold spores trapped in most school carpet. If you add water to the mix, mold growth will get a foothold rapidly. It is difficult to impossible to clean mold growth out of a carpet. Note mats that are trapping moisture below their rubber backing. Throughout the school, note present or past evidence of staining on ceiling surfaces. Sometimes it's just been painted over. It may be fine and dandy. Just make a note. Is it old or new damage? A moisture meter can tell you. Is it plaster or wallboard? Plaster defends itself against mold growth much more effectively than wallboard. Another question comes up. Is there mold growth on the top side of the ceiling surface? Dead or alive, extensive mold growth is a problem that needs to be outlined and corrected. Dead and dry mold is just as bad for humans as live wet mold because the trouble is in the DNA. A mushroom growing out of the carpet is a pretty good clue. Maybe your nose will lead you to the coffee filter that's been sitting in the maker for a week or more. Or to the plant that gets overwatered by well-meaning souls. If you see efflorescence on a concrete or cinder block wall, it means moisture is moving from more to less, from the wet interior or other side of the wall toward the dry interior of the room, carrying with it lime that forms the fuzz. A quick check with the moisture meter confirms a damp situation. And a drill allows trapped moisture to escape. We've said to think of concrete as a rigid sponge. Why is this walk-off mat placed in the middle of a classroom? In this case, it's hiding the slit in the linoleum that allowed the glue that never dried to squeegee up from the concrete slab that never stopped wicking moisture from groundwater below. And the red paint never dried on the maintenance room floor either. Why is there an obvious ring under every desk, chair, floor mat in the room? The floor is relatively dry at the edge of the mat, but in the middle, the mat has trapped moisture wicking up from the concrete slab through the carpet, saturating it, and feeding mold growth. This garbage bag stuck to the wall to keep wallboard dry in a splashy area may not look terrific, but it gets the job done, keeping moisture away from the vulnerable materials. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about some more fundamentals of moisture dynamics. If the source of excess moisture is not from a leak from outside or the plumbing, it could be from condensation of moisture in the air onto a cool surface. This pane of glass is cooler than the dew point temperature that corresponds to the temperature and relative humidity in the room, so it is wet from moisture in the room air. This psychrometric chart shows us that there is nothing random about the relationship among air temperature, relative humidity, and dew point temperature in a given room or space. If it's 70 degrees and 50% relative humidity, the corresponding dew point temperature for that room is 50 degrees every single time. Therefore, by definition, anything in the room that is cooler than 50 degrees will be wet from condensation, be it a window pane, a cold water pipe, a glass of ice water, or your glasses when you just walked in from outside. And that moisture came from the air. So we want to avoid reaching dew point in order to keep things dry. In this room, the air temperature is 60 degrees, the relative humidity is 70%, the corresponding dew point temperature is then 48 degrees from the chart, and by golly, portions of the wall are 47 degrees, and therefore wet from condensation from moisture in the air. 1 degree made the difference. Just the cool spots, barely cooler than dew point, are wet from condensation. It's the laws of nature in action. This floor joist is moldy in a school under construction. Maybe the beam was soaked before it was installed. Maybe it was condensation. Regardless, make a note to enable timely, thorough cleanup. When warm, wet outside air is able to get into the guts of an air-conditioned structure, it's drawn from wet to dry and from warm to cold. In this case, moisture easily penetrated and saturated the drywall and collected behind the vapor barrier, which was vinyl wallpaper, where it gave pre-existing mold spores a reason to thrive. By the way, don't be like my pal Rich Brill here and peel it all the way back. That's a pretty nasty exposure for anybody, much less a sensitive individual. Here's another less dramatic example of condensation accumulating behind a vapor barrier, vinyl wallpaper. Condensate moisture from heating, ventilating, and air conditioning equipment can accumulate in drip pans and support mold growth if it's not properly managed. So why do we not collect air samples during our walkthrough? You don't need to test anything to determine there's a mold problem in this room, do you? Typically, there's no need to sample air in a room with no visible mold either. In fact, rarely do we need to do any air sampling for investigation or remediation. There is a place for air sampling, but we rarely encounter it in schools. Industry leaders do not recommend air sampling because it is very unlikely that airborne mold samples will provide evidence that can't be more easily and reliably obtained by a thorough visual inspection. If you must sample, this is a common method using a spore trap and a vacuum pump. If you don't need the results to make a decision, don't sample. Save the money to spend on abatement if necessary. Air sampling is a last resort and is done for specific reasons. Lawyers or doctors may need to know, for example. At best, air sampling for mold is just a snapshot of current conditions that can change minutes later. Sample in the breathing zone. How do you interpret the sample results? There are no magic numbers of so many spores per cubic meter, say, that present a problem. It always depends. Always collect a sample of fresh outside air for comparison to inside results. We do want to find less mold inside than outside, and we want to find a similar mix of molds. We don't want to find molds airborne inside that are not also outside, as this may point to an indoor source where the unaccounted for mold is growing. When a given checklist is done, tap the Submit button and you'll get a prompt to confirm that you're done, followed by a pop-up menu to choose what app you want to use to send the report to your indoor air quality coordinator. Any issues found on the walkthrough should trigger work orders for rapid action to limit property damage and occupant exposure. We may not have time to investigate the full extent of a moisture issue during a walkthrough, but since we looked, we can credit ourselves with starting the fix and stopping the progress the moisture and mold are making toward contaminating our school. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Dave. Thank you for that intensive walkthrough mold assessment and for assuring us, too, that although dealing with a mold problem can be tricky, mold cannot hide from a thorough investigation. And thanks also for so many of the tips that you gave us for being able to address mold practically and cost-effectively, and especially for helping us figure out what data we need to collect and how to best use it. So we can all use Dave's overarching walkthrough investigation imperatives of discussion, observation, and measurements to really operationalize the framework strategies. Mold and moisture issues tend to trigger a duck and cover strategy that can be lethal to the trust and confidence that is needed to get stakeholders to invest in your efforts. Use the walkthrough assessment as a tool to foster the discussions that demonstrate your transparency and your inclusiveness. So much of your success requires that all staff are trained to observe and identify the clues leading to a potential mold or moisture problem. This is a job that extends beyond the custodial, maintenance, and facility staff to include all staff and occupants. That is the only way to address mold issues at the source and root them out. And as Dave so eloquently explained, when it comes to mold and moisture, there are some measurements that are extremely useful and some that really are not. The difference often is knowing how you plan to use the results of your measures. Our next speaker will address some of the components you can put in place to help coordinate your school's assets and staff to develop just such a plan. Peggy Caruso is currently the Assistant Director of the Katy Independent School District's Maintenance and Operations and Environmental Department. Peggy has always been a strong supporter of the U.S. EPA's Tools for Schools program. She's been recognized for her leadership and sustained dedication to schools across the state of Texas. Peggy's other responsibilities include environmental compliance, asbestos, water quality, hazard communication, integrated pest management, and building envelope. She is also a licensed mold consultant and contractor in the state of Texas and was a participant in developing the state regulations. Please join me in welcoming Peggy Caruso.
Hello, everyone. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Katy Independent School District. It's a fast-growing school district. We opened 3 campuses this year. We have a high school that's scheduled to open in the summer of 2017, and another one pretty far down the road, but in the planning stages due to changes in demographics. Today, I'll share with you some of the ways Katy Independent School District has put together a program to garner financial support for key components and mold and moisture mitigation. I'll tell you about the Katy ISD program and what the EPA Tools for Schools embodies in our school district. We do have a proactive approach to a healthy environment. We have a team dedicated to the work that incorporates indoor air quality, integrated pest management, asbestos management, chemical management, and material management. We also have a person on the team dedicated to the Tools for Schools walkthrough inspections. We participate in the long-range facility planning. Our preventive maintenance program is progressive. Why do I say our program is progressive? This year we might use moisture meters to check for moisture in high probability areas, but next year our testing might be more toward corrective actions or destructive investigations. I'm in the mid-management position, as the Assistant Director of Maintenance Operations. I can tell you that the IAQ walkthrough inspections does add value to the district. The walkthrough is an overall view of the building conditions, possibly the only single package overview. When you begin to garner financial support, indoor air quality must be included in the discussions. You will see how this works in Katy on the next slide, but when you discuss how a component affects indoor air quality, including mold and moisture, you actively give support to that needed replacement. These discussions change the internal and external culture. You'll be asked questions like, how is the plumbing in this building affecting the indoor environment? For financial support, first start with an asset management plan. Asset management is expected, if not required in some states. You know the importance. However, do you have an operations plan, and how often do you update your plan? A school district can have multiple failures, which can cause you to be in a reactive mode and without funding if you do not know your assets. Maybe it's been several years since you updated the long-range facility plan or held a bond election. It happened in Katy at one time. Under qualified leadership, a corrective assessment began. The team shown on the next slide walked the facilities, rated the specific components, and came back together to discuss. I'll take you through this process in the next slides. Most maintenance craftsmen know well the building that they service. It makes them the perfect part of the team. When the documentation begins, the scoring could look like this. The highest rating would be for a new building or component still under warranty. An example of a problem could be an HVAC system that has had several, if not over $25,000 expended on repairs in a single year, with an expected replacement date of 10 years, could be scored as a 12, marginal but operating. After the teams inspect, moving to the next slide, Katy came back to together to prioritize. In the particular HVAC example given in the last slide, the discussions revealed that the indoor air quality department has had numerous complaints, and the humidity is high enough to cause apparent microbial growth on walls and furniture in some areas of the building during unoccupied times. The indoor air quality department scores that particular location with a 6, concern with the system. The particular HVAC component in this facility moved to a faster plan of action and higher priority on the funding scale. Reviewing components of each building, old, new, and renovated, would be the same process. Part of your mold prevention and remediation plan will be to make others aware of the critical nature of these problems. An older building with odors could indicate a problem with the building envelope. My final example is a facility in 1984 with a built-up roof that was reported to the bond committee to be in poor condition, causing numerous leaks and interior damage from multiple failures in the building envelope. The documentation of the problems not only came from the craft, the inspection, and the work order system, but included the survey of the building administration, which is highly regarded in Katy. The budget needed for replacement of the roof and roofing components was $1.3 million, but it was approved by the bond committee. So the first year after that re-roof, you would continue your scoring, change your scoring for that portion of the building to a 20 for the building envelope. You would put a placeholder replacement date at the end of the warranty period, 2036 or beyond. Performing annual inspections will let you know how on track your building envelope is reporting. So this is a continuation of what you would start at the beginning with your asset management, and you would keep that up on a routine basis. Tracy?
Thank you, Peggy. So, we talk a lot about the guidance that you find in the kit, the framework for putting that guidance into action, and the technical solutions being the things that you act on. And it can seem like a lot, and it's really helpful when we have an example like Peggy Caruso and the way that she shared the story of what's happening in Katy Independent School District to really put a face and an example to how you operationalize all of these elements. And, especially, Peggy, when I hear your story, when we talk about the planning key driver, which is really the driver that's where the money lives, is in planning. And when we talk about short and long-term goals, one of the hardest things to deal with often is if you're in the midst of a crisis, people are often able to address the short-term goals because they're compelled to. They must do it. And to lose sight of the long-term goals that will help prevent these same kinds of problems from happening in the future. And what you laid out here is a prime example of how you go about addressing the immediate needs while still keeping a view on the long game, on being able to really create those long-term goals that will translate into the kinds of powerful dialogues you need to have with your funding sources so that they're able to support the kinds of sustained interventions and remediations you're going to need in the long run. So bravo for providing that example of how we keep our eye on the immediate ball, but also what's down the road. And as Peggy demonstrated here also, securing the funding for comprehensive mold and moisture plans require addressing the entire culture of operations. That means building mold and moisture assessment into every single component of the building investigation. And often that means, and you heard it very clearly in Peggy's story, that means successfully coordinating all of these different departments and different staff people who might not be that accustomed to interacting with one another. And that is where the Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools kit and the mobile app come to the rescue with helping to coordinate all of those various elements. During this walkthrough, you heard about the importance of employing the organized key driver to involve a wide range of staff and occupants. So in addition to the areas that Dave pointed out in the walkthrough checklist where mold and moisture issues are identified, numerous other items are embedded in the various other checklists where mold and or moisture issues are likely to occur and possibly be overlooked. For instance, the classroom checklist that you see here engages teachers in observing and acting on excess moisture in the classroom. The buildings and grounds checklist emphasizes the importance of taking action on interior and exterior environments to promptly deal with moisture, leaks, and spills, especially in what are sometimes neglected areas. And this checklist also spotlights the need to protect the building envelope from moisture intrusion, and we've heard about that importance of the building envelope repeatedly during the webinar. The ventilation checklist ensures that you're prepared to act on a variety of issues, including seemingly small things that can have a big impact, like making sure drain pans are checked so that they are not a source of moisture that can harbor mold growth. The mobile app can make the job of everyone involved in the indoor air quality program so much easier. It can help you gather all the needed information, organize it, and prioritize what needs to be done to ensure good indoor air quality in your school buildings and improve the health and well-being for all of your students, teachers, and staff. Use the mobile app to engage everyone in your school when developing a proactive mold and moisture plan that secures the funds you need to keep your school safe, clean, and healthy for everyone. Okay? So you've heard a lot of great resources and information today, and we invite you to continue your exploration of these resources. We have a wide range of them, and so dive deeply into each of these resources to find what you need to protect your schools and school districts. Additionally, the same kinds of real-life examples that you have heard here from Peggy Caruso and in the intensive walkthrough that we saw with Dave Blake, you can find those many other stories like that elaborated through many of our other essential resources. Additionally, our School Health and Indoor Environments Leadership Development Network partner, the Association for Learning Environments, is making it possible for you to receive 1.5 learning units towards the American Institute of Architects continuing education units. Information for applying for these credits will be coming to you soon in a follow-up email. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for participating in this webinar and also make one final request for your next action. I'm going to ask you to fill out the webinar evaluation form that you will receive to help us better serve and support your needs. We read and take into consideration every single evaluation and apply what we learn towards the next set of resources that we provide. At the end of the evaluation, please access your personalized certificate of completion and display it as a demonstration of your commitment to take action for clean, safe, and healthy school indoor environments. Thank you for attending this webinar. This concludes the presentation portion of the webinar for today, but please stay on the line for an active question and answer with our speakers. Today's expert panel for question and answer includes our two speakers, as well as Dave Hill, the Executive Director of Facilities and Operations from Blue Valley Schools in Overland Park, Kansas, Laura Olson, the Manager of Environmental Health and Safety in Frederick County Public Schools in Frederick, Maryland, and Fred Ramelius, the Director of Operations at Upper Merion Area School District in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. So, I want to start out, especially by addressing our school districts. So when we saw those headlines, and, I'm sure everyone's, palms start to sweat a little bit when they see headlines like that, because we know that no one is immune from these kinds of problems. And when the media gets a hold of mold, it can go south really quickly. But one of the things also, when we were investigating some of the stories behind those headlines, the very last headline that came up was really interesting because it wasn't, one of these kind of inflammatory headlines. What it actually said was that the school district was addressing a mold issue. And when I clicked on the link and went to the news story about it, they had their facilities director there talking about it. And because they had a mold remediation plan in place, I could tell that the way that he'd engaged with that journalist completely flipped the way that that story was told. And it ended up being about, yes, they found the mold, but it gave him a platform to talk about how they were addressing it, how they found it, how they were able to investigate, find it, what was actually going on, and how they were remediating it. And so I just would like to invite, starting with Peggy and then invite some of our other districts, to talk about your kind of communication strategies around mold and moisture, how it is that you work with staff and parents and the media around mold issues, and sort of how that plays out in your districts, that communication strategy for mold. So Peggy, I'll invite you to start.
Okay, well, I walk the walk and talk the talk. As you said, EPA Tools for Schools is our best practice procedures, and I pretty much just visit with, for instance, a teacher in a classroom, a principal, whenever I'm invited to answer questions or to let them know that there's a problem in the school. They are very appreciative of the upfront information you can give them, and that you know that you have a procedure to follow, and that you're doing it to the best of your ability. So that's pretty much where we start. We're upfront with it, and we tell them that we do have a best practice procedure, and this is our time frame. This is what you can expect to happen, and we're going to make sure that you're happy when the job's done. The communication to parents, I haven't been too involved with recently, but it would be the same conversation.
Terrific. Dave Hill, if you can also share a little bit about sort of what the communication strategy looks like there in Blue Valley when you're working with mold.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tracy. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this question and answer session. Our responses look very similar to what Peggy talked about in her school district. We operate with absolute transparency. We want parents to know what we're doing and what we find and how we're going to fix it and how long that's going to take. We want them to trust us, and we see these as opportunities to share with our community, our patrons, what we're doing and what kinds of plans we have in place. And hopefully, like you said earlier with that other example, we flip the script, and they come away with an appreciation for how we're maintaining these environments for their children. We do say a lot of times they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so we respond with empathy, and we really try to keep them involved along the way. We don't pretend that mold doesn't exist and that our buildings don't leak. Despite our best efforts, we know they're going to. So we accept that, and instead we put in place a plan to respond.
Dave, thank you so much. And that empathy factor, when we were putting together the technical solutions, and we vetted them with school districts across the country, and when we said, is this everything? Do you think that we've really hit on all of the key areas that you need to be addressing? The only thing that came back, and it turns out that this is one of the things that really goes across, it's a vein that runs through all of the work, is just what you're talking about there. One of our friends in Charlotte Mecklenburg in North Carolina, he says, the only thing that I would add is that that social and economic and emotional factor when you're addressing these issues, because it's not just all about the practical side or the facility side of dealing with it. You really are dealing with the people as well. And so being able to respond, to listen intently, to respond with empathy, and to let people know how much you care is really almost an ace technical solution in our mind. Laura Olson, anything that you would want to add from Frederick County about the way that you address and communicate when you have mold issues?
Very similar issues to everyone that's mentioned. The face-to-face time is so important. We use an expression here in Frederick County that we call closing the loop, which means if one of us from our division comes out, whether it be a maintenance person, custodial person, or me from my department, we want to make sure that the occupant, the principal, whoever we're dealing with, sees that we care and that we get back to them in a timely fashion with what's going on. Sometimes if someone's repairing something and they've got things ripped out of the wall and they leave and there's tools and this and that, the person sitting there thinking, when's this going to get fixed? On the opposite end of that, by closing the loop, if our maintenance person explains, ma'am, I can't close this up right now, I've got to go get some parts, I'll be back, and here's what I'm going to do, makes the difference. It builds that confidence and doesn't leave someone wondering and then running off in 6 directions communicating with everybody because they want someone to care. So very similar approaches to what everyone is saying. I like the expression flipping the script. that really does bring it around to being able to share what we do proactively and in concert with EPA recommendations. And when you can state those things, people have more confidence that you're not just flying on your own. You're using recognized tools and assets to solve problems.
That's awesome, Laura. And and it's really good to hear how in concert, how harmonized all of your responses are, and it's a demonstration of the excellence that you bring to the work. And I suspect with Fred Ramelius there in Pennsylvania, it'll be the same. And anything else that you want to add to the power of really strong communication around your mold program?
This is Fred Ramelius. One of the things that I would add is to take advantage of the EPA's resource and to use their name as your sword and shield when you go out and you address issues, that you tell people that we're going to investigate your concerns using the U.S. EPA's tools for schools, because people recognize the EPA's name, and that will help deflect some of the criticisms and add confidence that people have in what you're doing. And then also on the other side of the coin, that when you need some backbone support to get the financial assistance that you need to address mold issues, that when you start bringing up the EPA's name for replacing roofs and fixing leaks and so forth, your school board and your administrators generally recognize the U.S. EPA as an organization that has some clout. And the same thing when you're working with teachers and administrators who contribute to the problem by not doing their side of the work that needs to get done, like having cluttered classrooms and things of that nature, that you can again invoke the U.S. EPA's name and says, hey, these are the requirements or the standards or the suggestions that the U.S. EPA has, and it tends to get people's attention and gives you some clout to go do the things that you need to do as a facility manager.
Excellent, Fred. Thank you. We are more than happy to operate as the sword and shield for your program. And I have to say, when you say that, it's very gratifying to us, especially given the fact that this is a non-regulatory program. It's a voluntary program, and that we have about half of the country, school districts in the country now saying that they have an indoor air quality management program in place. Is I think another thing that you can add to your quiver. If I can add another, another tool there, you can add to your quiver to say that, it's not that we know that other school districts are doing this and doing it successfully. And from EPA's perspective, I think one of the most important things that we add to being able to promote and defend the importance of healthy indoor air quality and in schools is the fact that we have so many mentor school districts across the country, so many folks who are leaders in their school districts, who are administrators in their school districts, who have bought into this work, and you hear them throughout all of the webinar series. You see them in our resources, and so I would also invite people. Part of the strength of our program is that we are the national name around indoor air quality in schools with EPA, but what bolsters that is the fact that school districts like yours have engaged with the program, have actual results to be able to share, and have that mentorship and leadership to be able to recruit and incorporate what you've done into spreading that model through other school districts. So really our strength is on your shoulders. Please tap into that as one of the best resources that we offer, is collecting all of that collective wisdom and putting it back out there. So Fred, also, I talked earlier about And it's really true. When it comes to mold and moisture, there is not a single technical solution that is not impacted in one way or another by mold and moisture, and they don't operate independently. One of our champions talked about how the 7 technical solutions are like keeping 7 balls in the air. You know, you may have 1 or 2 in your hand at any time that you have to deal with, but you got to keep an eye on everything that's in the air at the same time. And so 2 of the areas that I think are really important when we talk about putting together a remediation plan, when we talk about being proactive, to me that is, you know, part and parcel of also being able to have what we call for in the cleaning and maintenance technical solution, putting together a preventative maintenance plan. And I know that that is something that that you have been a huge champion of and has been near and dear to your heart. So I'm going to have you start talking about, Fred, have you start talking about some of the keys to preventative maintenance, and especially as it relates to mold and moisture, but any of the keys that you have found to putting in place a really solid preventative maintenance plan and the impact that it can have on the bottom line of school districts. And then I'm going to invite some of the other districts to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I've been a champion of preventive maintenance since my early career 30 years ago now in the Navy, where they figured out that if you don't do preventive maintenance on your ships and you're 5,000 miles away from home, it's a long way to row to get back to civilization. And so they instituted those programs years ago. And there's a program that the General Services Administration from the federal government, which is the world's largest real estate holder, has, where they put together PM procedures for almost every component of a school building or commercial building. And what we found at Upper Merion is when we put our program together 10 years ago, that we saw a significant decline in our repair costs, our utility bills, and equally important that when we tell our energy management systems or our building automation systems to open air dampers and to turn on exhaust fans and to turn on air handling units and do those things that we need to do to control fresh air in the buildings and so forth, that they actually now work. And that's a huge component of keeping mold out of your buildings and so forth. And having that level of confidence that when you push the button on a piece of equipment that it's going to work enables you to really save a lot of money and improve the air quality for the students and staff in the buildings. And you know, probably the other things that I've learned over time is that you know, I learned the hard way that if it leaks, you know, I have to jump on it and make sure that my staff understand that leaking roofs and leaking walls and plumbing leaks are never to be allowed to get out of control, and that's a priority here. And that I, as a facilities manager, that I have to go looking for mold. That when I walk through a classroom and I see a stained ceiling tile, that immediately I'm taking a picture of it and I'm sending it to the appropriate trade and saying, who's taking care of this, what are we doing about it, and I follow up on those kind of things. And probably the other single biggest lesson that I learned in my career is that when people complain, they usually have a real complaint. And when I first started, you know, I'd get a complaint and I go, well, I'd go in there, look around and smell and didn't see anything and kind of say, well, they must be whining about something. But more often than not, I'd be embarrassed and later on find out what the real issues were and had to take care of it. So if there are complaints, you need to address them like they are really valid complaints. And more often than not, there really is something behind it that is affecting that person, because again, in today's world, there are so many students, so many teachers who have asthma and all kinds of other hypersensitivities to this, that, and the other, that you need to be responsive and responsible to them and go address them so that the education process continues.
Tracy, this is Dave Hill. I agree with everything that Fred said. Very well said. I would add that we, in our school district, we're almost obsessive over new construction and reconstruction of our buildings. We pay attention to making sure the proper moisture barriers are in place on the slab. We look for a proper cure time of concrete. When walls are going up, we make sure the wall cavity design is not only designed adequately to wick away moisture, but is also built properly. So we put in place construction observers to actually watch the people as they build the buildings, or maybe even with the roofing systems, we'll watch them at key times during construction to make sure that those roof plies and those flashings and those seals are all constructed per plan, to make sure that we're getting what we pay for. Because if we found, just rule of thumb, that if we spend $1 during that construction period, it pays back $7 in avoidance of problems later on.
That is awesome, Dave. You know, it was as Fred was talking, I was thinking, I was about to call on you, and you got right in there, because I think one of the first times you know, I came to an understanding of like dealing with the building envelope was in talking to you, and you know, the aggressive policies that you put in place there in Blue Valley around protecting the building envelope in that way, and you know, having those observers we saw in Dave Blake's walkthrough. During construction, you don't know when they saw wet materials there, but were able to identify them. So having those observers there are really critical component of being able to, even in the new construction phase, be able to avoid problems before they get built, before they get baked in. Right. So others on any preventative maintenance tips for dealing with mold or moisture that you want to share?
Tracy, this is Laura Olson. Just to touch on that, from a money and investment standpoint, going back to Dave showing the great equipment that he used, lots of different examples. A very small investment, and as he pointed out, the cost of this kind of equipment for moisture meters and even IR cameras has come down significantly. So I really think it's something that's reasonably affordable for a district or a department, and is such a great tool for being able to identify both from a preventive as well as a, you know, what do we need to do about it once we found it standpoint, because you can really pinpoint where the source of the problem is and get rid of that moisture.
Excellent. Actually, that segues into one of the really quick questions we had here about moisture meters. One of our listeners wanted to know, do moisture meters have calibration requirements?
Tracy, I'll weigh in on how I utilize mine. Depending on the model that you get, many of these came, I believe, from the wood industry, checking lumber, gym floors, those kinds of installations. So one of the ways that I utilize the meter that I have is to sort of field calibrate it against known control surfaces. So for example, I'll come into a room and I can utilize drywall in that space that I know is not able to be impacted by a moisture source, like from an outside wall or leaking window, for example, and then use that as a reference point. Dave also pointed out some rough ranges. I think that's going to depend on the meter that you use, but you can utilize the existing space to get sort of a frame of reference point and what sort of numbers you're looking at on whatever surface you're investigating, and then use the surface you're looking at to gauge how much more moist that is than some other surface. And then, of course, the pin utilization can help you, no pun intended, probe even further into what the problem might be.
Terrific. Dave Blake, anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I've had a bunch of moisture meters, and I've never bothered to calibrate any of them. But I think that's an excellent point made that if you go into any space, the wall should be between 8, 10, 12%. Bone dry should be right in that area. So if you start with what's known dry, then you can really tell if something's getting out of whack. But to be honest with you, it's never crossed my mind. I've always trusted my meters until they just stop putting up numbers.
All right. Thanks, Dave. So we have a question here about that is related to smart material selection. As we said, all of the technical solutions come into play here. And I'm just going to read it verbatim, and you guys can respond. Materials being selected for schools is very important. We get a lot of questions about flooring for basements. What types of materials are best for specific rooms, et cetera. And so, for an example, they say when selecting flooring for basement concrete, there are new vinyl materials, looks like wood and lifetime guarantees, all plastic, no wood paper products. However, do you think a viable choice for a school or home based upon the nature of cement wicking and being near basement drains? And so the idea, the basic question here is about material selection in tricky areas, especially like basement concrete, and what kinds of materials you recommend, or what you have found to work really well.
All right, Tracy Laura Olson, I'll take a shot at that. It's almost a sore point in our district, a battle of sorts between our construction division, where they're hiring architects, and the architects are always wanting to, introduce the latest and greatest materials. So I empathize with the questioner that it's something that comes up fairly often, because there's always that latest and greatest mousetrap that's come along. And you don't want to be the guinea pig school district trying out the latest and greatest thing. Don't ask me how I know that. I think, from my viewpoint, regardless of what sort of surface we're looking at, to me the key is what's already there below the ground that could impact. If you're in an area that has, some issues with the groundwater table, or if you're not careful to grade the property so that water moves away properly from the building. I don't care what kind of surface you're putting in there. If you haven't solved that problem, from the bottom up and the outside in, I'm thinking is going to be more of an issue in many instances than what you select for the surface, starting out with the construction side of it.
This is Fred Ramilius. I'll just relay a couple of stories that we've had over the years. And the biggest issues that we've had are floors that are slab on grade, whether they're basement or just slab on grade floors, is that no matter how good you are at putting in a vapor barrier, vapor still is going to come up through the concrete and get into the flooring material. And what we have found is that those materials which have a solid backing, like a vinyl, vinyl back carpet, linoleum kind of products, welded sheet goods for gymnasium floors, that they will have moisture issues because the moisture inevitably just can't escape. And because we're using environmentally friendly water-based glues, the glues never firmly adhere. And I have a gym floor that's 17 years old now, and glue still comes up through the floor and whenever there's a crack because of that. And we had another elementary school, a library, that had a vinyl-backed sheet good carpet with solid seams on it, and it started to blister everywhere. And we ended up going back and taking up all of that carpet prematurely because it was becoming a tripping hazard, and we replaced it with carpet squares where at least there was some room for the moisture to get out between the individual tiles. And then the other thing that I've noticed at one of our newer schools is the epoxy terrazzo type floors that, again, once they dry, they do not allow any moisture to wick up through the concrete and escape into the atmosphere, and you'll actually get pimples all up and down your hallways and so forth. And if you drill little holes in them, the moisture will just come right out of those pimples. So the big thing is to be careful about, to do like Dave said to begin with, to make sure that there's really good vapor barriers. But when those fail, that there's some means by which the moisture can escape through the flooring and get out.
This is Dave Hill. I will follow up on that and a couple of things. someone said earlier about making sure that not only is the building properly constructed, but also that you're getting moisture and ponding water away from the building at the building perimeter. Make sure you've got good exterior drainage, because even if you've got a properly constructed slab and moisture barriers, if water's not properly directed away from the building, it can find its way back in and corrupt that system. But I also wanted to say, in terms of flooring products, there are a lot of different reasons to choose specific types of flooring. If you're needing an acoustically sound area, you may consider carpet. But in high traffic areas, we're starting to experiment with polished concrete, and we're getting fantastic results and lots of great feedback with our polished concrete efforts. You don't have to expend the number of man hours and finishes and chemicals that are applied to VCT type tile or other hard surfaces, and it looks great if it's properly done. So we have some old floors. We went to a high school that was over 20 years old, pulled up all the VCT in the main hallways and commons, and ground and polished the concrete, and it looks like terrazzo. And so we may have spent about 2.5 to 3 times as much as we would have on VCT, but we're going to be recouping that savings every year for the life of that floor in reduced chemical purchases and reduced maintenance costs from not having to strip and clean those every year.
I think that's great. And this is Peggy with Katie. I can't speak to basements because we don't have basements here, but I'm glad that everybody is talking on the topic. And I agree with Dave about the concrete. Even if it's not polished concrete, sealed concrete looks really nice. And it has a very low maintenance as far as to keep it looking nice, upkeep. Dave, in his presentation, was showing a floor mat on carpet underneath of a desk that he found moisture somewhere close to the middle of that floor. So it doesn't have to be basement, but those kind of solid that doesn't let the moisture escape, I think actually kind of draws the moisture in. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from the slab or the concrete, because I have found the same exact thing happening where custodians are cleaning around the area and they will maybe do some water extraction or a little bit of carpet cleaning, and that moisture is going to wick underneath of that. I think any solid vinyl product flooring in the flooring industry would hate me to hear me say this, is you're asking for trouble, because there's too many sources of water in a school district, there's too many drains, and that installation has to be just so perfect to not allow an area where that moisture can, even from the top side of the flooring, find its way in any crack or crevice underneath. And you'll obviously get a mold staining or bubbling, cracking, popping up. It shows itself very quickly. And I think that it's not a good flooring product.
Awesome. Thank you all for weighing in so well on that question. And you know, one of the best things that we have, like I said, is that everyone who's involved in our network, everyone has all these different experiences to share. And one of our participants wanted just to add a comment to say, under slab ventilation would also be helpful, and if you are susceptible to radon, it solves this problem as well. And so thank you, Ken, from Lower Merion. One of the things that some of you have touched on in your responses, and especially Dave Hill, when you were talking about doing the polished concrete, and you said the initial outlay of funds is more than it would have been if you'd gone in a different direction, but over the long term, when you're setting those long-term goals, you know that you're going to recoup it. So this is about mold, moisture, and money, right? And one of the questions comes in about funding resources, and we know that there's not some big bag of mold and moisture money in the sky, except for when you have a mold crisis, and then all of a sudden the money shows up to remediate it. And it's not magical money. It didn't just come from nowhere. It is being pulled from other sources where it was planned to be used to address a crisis. I'd like you guys to just help us understand, too, in your districts, what the what the funding process looks like for you in order to be able to make those kinds of investments up front that are going to save in the long term. And I know that in many cases it's a long process of building that trust, of collecting the data, of doing the assessments, of involving different folks. But if you can just talk a little bit about some of the highlights for people, some of the advice that you would give them about being able to work with funding sources to support your programs in the short and the long term.
Tracy, this is Laura from Frederick. You segued perfectly because it really is about your funding sources. On my notes here, I've labeled them as, our funding stakeholders. And going back to both what Dave and Peggy mentioned in terms of an assets inventory is so important. It can seem overwhelming when you're starting in your district to look at how do we manage these things, and I often make the analogy of eating the elephant, one bite at a time, and this is that type of situation where you have the assets inventory, you develop that, and that's your starting place for identifying where you have high priority problems, things that can maybe wait. You build upon that, but then what we've done here in Frederick is use that as a tool to both educate our board, our state and local officials, and building upon a confidence that when they're funding us, they're going to have assurance that we're managing that asset and looking in the long term. So it's taken many years, but we have a confidence level with our officials now that we're making good utilization of that money, and the assets and that relationship helps us manage exactly what you're talking about, avoiding those crisis moments. If we can argue that over the next 10 years we'd like to put X amount of dollars towards this roof or this wall or that problem, it's a lot easier for them to say yes and to put at least some money towards it and build upon resolving problems than, as you pointed out, it often becomes a crisis and they find money from other things, and you're obviously hurting some other program by doing that.
Tracy, this is Dave. I'll just weigh in as well. Our story sounds similar to that one. We have a great relationship with our Board of Education. We meet with them on a monthly basis. We have what's called a Board Advisory Committee that includes patrons, citizens in our school district, and board members, not the entire board, but a few of our board members that allow us to take deep dives into understanding why it's important to do preventive maintenance and to properly design and build buildings, to observe construction, and to pay for things up front so they are addressed as smaller problems and don't ever become bigger problems. And you've heard me use the analogy before, but we like to talk about pushing on the flywheel. To start our program, we had to start somewhere to push that flywheel and get it moving, get it in motion. And it's a series of small steps, and each time you push on that flywheel a little more, it adds momentum. And our flywheel in our district is spinning pretty fast. So we have the opportunity sometimes to try new things, and to sometimes we're allowed some grace to try things and to experiment and to continue to try to get better. But we have a very healthy relationship with our board, and they're very supportive of making sure that we invest in our facilities and do the things we need to do to take care of them so that they don't become bigger problems later on.
Excellent. Fred, I know that you're such a champion of preventative maintenance, and I know that can often be one of the hardest sells for folks, especially when they're looking at some of the immediate kind of budget needs and that kind of thing. So, what has your experience been like in garnering the kind of support financially that you need to be able to put some of the things that you talked about in place?
Having a preventive maintenance program in the grand scheme of things is relatively inexpensive. It's a management tool. We're starting up our next generation of computerized maintenance management software, and our annual subscription cost for our school district is around $4,000 a year. And once you go through the process of inventorying your equipment and writing your procedures, it doesn't cost you anything to do that. And it really is, it's a huge savings to school districts. There are a bunch of studies out there that savings in terms of energy and in terms of maintenance repair costs from not having to replace motors because they weren't lubricated and doing things of that nature, that the savings is in the 10 to 15% range. And, you know, when you start talking to school board members and financial directors and superintendents, and you look at your utility budget, what it is today, and you simply tell them, if we put these programs in place, that we will see those kind of significant savings, that gets their attention. And we did it here quietly, and you know, so we didn't need to go out and sales pitch, but it really helped us, and people started seeing what we were doing, and it made us champions later on. And you know, I rarely get HVAC calls now to where people are complaining a lot because it's cold and or hot or whatever. You know, the preventive maintenance part, it is difficult and it's time-consuming to implement from an administrative perspective, but again, the GSA procedures that are out there, and there are other manuals that'll help you do that, and there's slick, easy ways to inventory your equipment, and there's good software packages out there now that are, you know, reasonable to do a large or small or a large school district. So you know, I'd encourage everybody to look at that avenue. You'd be amazed in a couple of years, and again, the word long-term keeps cropping up in this conversation, that those are long-term things that will pay dividends hugely for many, many years.
Excellent. Fred, thank you so much. And, you know, I think that that's a really fine place for us to bring this question and answer to a conclusion. You know, I think hearing from all of you about how you have been able to work through so many of the elements of the framework to evaluate and identify your assets, to be able to build and have the kind of communication and organization that allows you to build the confidence in your staff, in your school boards, your funders, to make this, to make it much easier to make a business case for the work that you're doing, and the way that you're able to really identify ROI, return on investment, and not just, as we said, in terms of dollars. But the last thing that you were saying there, Fred, about the reduction in complaints and the fact that you have a more satisfied occupants, and how that also, all of those things play into the value of this work. And so I think that all of you have expressed important elements of a value proposition that creates a business case for doing this kind of preventative work around mold and moisture that garners the kinds of financial support that's necessary to sustain your programs. And for those of you who are more interested in finding out how it is different school districts are putting together this value proposition, how they really are getting a business management mind around this, please go into our resources, go into the different stories from that we've collected from school districts across the country who are having the same kind of stellar results that you're hearing from our speakers today, and begin to prepare yourself also for understanding your assets, telling the story, and being able to support your indoor air quality management programs for the benefit of all of your students and staff. So with that, I would like to thank all of our speakers and all of our expert panelists on the question and answer today, and all of you expert participants as well, for your time and for your contributions. And we look forward to continuing to connect with you through the EPA Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools connector, as well as you visit our website. Do avail yourself of all of the on-demand webinars to take to educate yourself, your staff, and all of your stakeholders about the various elements of indoor air quality in your schools, and to help build the case. Thanks so much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.